For a grieving mother and her young son, a move back to a childhood home is supposed to be a retreat, a quiet place to heal. But some places don't forget. In the sprawling backyard of Sarah's old house stands an empty swing set, an echo of happier times. When one swing begins to move on its own, pushed by an unseen hand, Sarah fears her own sorrow is taking shape. But when her son, Josh, starts talking to an invisible friend named Leo, she uncovers a forgotten neighborhood tragedy, a lonely spirit who just wants a playmate. Forever. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The miles had dissolved behind them in a gray ribbon of highway, each one stretching the distance from the life they had lost. The hum of the tires on asphalt had been the only constant sound in the car for the last hour, a monotonous drone that filled the space between Sarah's silent grief and her son's. 7-year-old Josh sat strapped in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery, his face a small, pale mask. His silence was a weight, heavier than any suitcase packed in the trunk. Their destination was not a new beginning, but a retreat into the past, her childhood home. The 2-story colonial with its slightly faded blue shutters and sprawling oak in the front yard looked both comfortingly familiar and achingly strange. It was a place frozen in her memory, a museum of a life she no longer lived. Moving in with her mother, Helen, was a practical decision born from the financial and emotional wreckage of her husband Michael's death. The word widow still felt like a costume she was forced to wear, ill-fitting and abrasive against her skin. "We're here, sweetie," Sarah said, her voice attempting a cheerfulness that cracked around the edges. Josh didn't answer, just unbuckled his seatbelt as she killed the engine. The ensuing silence was profound, broken only by the chirping of a distant cricket. The first few days were a blur of unpacking boxes and navigating the quiet currents of the house. Her mother, Helen, was a gentle, hovering presence, her kindness a soft bandage on a wound that was still too raw to touch. She'd make them tea, offer quiet reassurances, and then retreat, leaving Sarah and Josh to find their footing in the shared space of their sorrow. Josh was a ghost in the house, flitting from room to room, his small shoulders slumped. He spent most of his time in the backyard, a wide, green expanse bordered by a weathered wooden fence. It was a yard full of memories for Sarah. Cartwheels on the grass, lightning bugs in a jar, the sweet taste of summer. Dominating the yard, just as it had for 30 years, was the old swing set. Its metal A-frame was flecked with rust, the red paint chipped and peeling, but it stood sturdy, a sentinel of her past. 2 swings, their plastic seats faded by decades of sun, hung from its crossbar. For Sarah, it was a symbol of a simpler, happier time, a time before the crushing complexities of adult loss. One evening, as dusk bled purple and orange across the sky, Sarah stood at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in warm, soapy water. Her gaze drifted out the window, past the patio furniture, and towards the swing set. The air was unnaturally still, the leaves on the trees hanging limp and motionless. And yet, one of the swings was moving. It wasn't a violent motion. It was a gentle, rhythmic back and forth, as if someone had been sitting there only a moment ago and had just gotten up, leaving their momentum behind as a fading signature. Sarah froze, the dish in her hands forgotten. She watched, transfixed, her breath caught in her throat. There was no wind, not a whisper. The flag on the neighbor's pole hung slack. The swing continued its unhurried arc, a silent pendulum counting seconds in the fading light, before slowly, gradually, coming to a complete stop. She shook her head, a cold prickle skittering up her spine. The wind. It had to be the wind. A strange, localized current, perhaps. A trick of the light. She was tired, grieving. Her mind was playing tricks on her, projecting her own inner turmoil onto the world outside. She finished the dishes, refusing to look out the window again. Over the next week, she tried to coax Josh into playing. "Want me to push you on the swings, honey? We could see who can go higher." Josh, who used to love swinging, just shook his head. He'd stand near the edge of the lawn, kicking at a loose clump of dirt, his eyes sometimes drifting toward the old metal frame. "Why not?" she asked gently one afternoon. He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the ground. "They're busy," he said, his voice small and final. Sarah's heart ached. He was creating his own reality to cope, building walls to keep the world out. She assumed busy was his own private code for the sadness that had taken up residence in their lives, a grief so large it occupied every empty space, even the seat of an old swing. She decided not to pry, not wanting to disturb the delicate architecture of his 7-year-old sorrow. She would let him heal in his own time. But as she watched him from the window, she couldn't shake the image of the swing, moving silently in the still evening air, waiting, busy. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lawn, painting the world in gold and black. Sarah was folding laundry in the living room, the scent of fabric softener a small, domestic comfort when she saw him. Josh was standing near the swing set, not 10 feet from the rust-flecked frame. His posture wasn't slumped or withdrawn. It was animated. His hands were moving and his head was cocked to one side as if listening intently. Then he spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the open screen door. "No, higher! You have to pump your legs, like this!" He demonstrated, kicking his own legs out in a mimicry of the motion. Sarah's hands stilled on a warm towel. She watched for a long moment as her son carried on a one-sided conversation with the empty space beside him. A part of her, the logical part, felt a wave of profound sadness. An imaginary friend. It was a classic coping mechanism for a child dealing with trauma, with loss, with a disorienting move. He was lonely. He missed his father. Of course he would create a companion. She stepped out onto the patio, her bare feet cool on the concrete. "Josh? Who are you talking to, sweetie?" she called, keeping her voice soft and non-judgmental. Josh turned, his expression not one of being caught, but of simple fact. "My new friend," he said, gesturing to the empty swing. "Leo. He likes the swings. He's waiting for me to push him." The name hung in the air. Leo. It felt solid, real. Sarah's heart didn't just ache, it sank, a heavy stone dropping into a cold well of unease. "Oh, well, that's nice. It's good you made a friend." She couldn't bring herself to play along, to ask Leo if he was having fun. The sight of her son talking so earnestly to nothingness was too jarring, a vivid illustration of the void Michael's absence had left. Later that evening, after Josh was bathed and engrossed in a cartoon, Sarah found herself drawn to the kitchen window again. The backyard was bathed in the pale, milky light of the moon, and the swing was moving. This time, there was no gentle, residual sway. This was different. The swing moved with purpose, climbing higher and higher, the chains groaning with a distinct, rhythmic creak-creak, creak-creak that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. It reached the peak of its arc, hung suspended for a breathtaking second, and then swept back down, a dark, spectral pendulum. The wind explanation, her flimsy shield of rationality, shattered into 1,000 pieces. Wind didn't do this. Wind didn't play. The next day, she brought it up with her mother. They were sitting at the kitchen table, nursing cups of coffee. "Josh has an imaginary friend," she began, trying to sound casual. "A boy named Leo. He says he meets him by the swings." Helen looked up from her cup, her brow furrowing. She didn't smile or offer a grandmotherly platitude about childhood imagination. Her expression clouded over, a subtle but definite shift. "Leo," she repeated. the name a strange flavor on her tongue. And the swing, Sarah hesitated, feeling foolish. I know it sounds crazy, but I've seen it moving, on its own, a lot. Helen's gaze shifted towards the window, a distant, troubled look in her eyes. She was quiet for a long time. That old thing, she finally muttered, her voice low. That swing set always had stories. There was always a sadness in this neighborhood, from a long, long time ago. What sadness? What do you mean? Sarah pressed, leaning forward. But the moment was gone. Helen seemed to shake herself, her focus returning to the kitchen, to the present. Oh, I don't know, dear. Old houses, old memories, you know how it is. She stood up and carried her cup to the sink, her back to Sarah. He's probably just lonely, that's all. It'll pass. The change of subject was abrupt, a door deliberately closed. But Sarah had seen it, the flicker of unease, the shadow of a memory her mother was unwilling or unable to confront. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the creaking swing and her son's new invisible friend were connected to a story someone had tried very hard to forget. In the weeks that followed, Leo went from being a background character in Josh's life to the protagonist. The invisible friend was no longer just a companion for lonely afternoons. He was an architect of Josh's new reality. His presence, once a source of melancholic concern for Sarah, was rapidly becoming one of genuine fear. It started with small things. At dinner, Josh would carefully cut a piece of his chicken and push it to the side of his plate. "This is for Leo," he'd explain. "He gets hungry." When Sarah would clear the plates later, the piece of food would be untouched, a cold, greasy offering to an unseen guest. Then came the rules. The games Josh played with Leo were governed by a strange and unsettling logic. One afternoon, Sarah found Josh sitting on the back steps, staring at the empty, motionless swings. "Why don't you go play, honey?" she asked. "Can't," Josh said, not looking at her. "Leo says you can only swing when no one is looking. It's the most important rule." Another time, she woke in the middle of the night to the sound of his bedroom door opening. She found him in the hallway, fully dressed, his hand on the doorknob to the backyard. "What are you doing, Josh?" she'd whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Leo says it's more fun to swing at night, when the moon is out. He says you can go higher in the dark." Each new rule was a thread in a web of dread that was tightening around Sarah. This wasn't the whimsical, creative play of a grieving child. This was something else. It felt coercive, secretive. Leo wasn't just a friend, he was an influence, pulling her son away from the light and into the shadows. The auditory phenomena grew more intrusive, more undeniable. The faint, rhythmic creak of the swing set became a nightly torment, a sound that seeped through her closed bedroom window and into her dreams. She'd lie awake, rigid in the dark, listening to the ghostly cadence. Some nights, she was sure she could hear another sound woven into it, the faint, distant echo of a child's laughter, thin and ethereal, carried on the still night air. It was a sound that should have been joyful, but instead, it was utterly terrifying. She had to know more. The fear for her son overrode her reluctance to upset her mother. She found Helen in the garden, tending to her roses. "Mom, we have to talk about this," she said, her voice firm. "About Josh, about Leo." Helen sighed, not looking up from a wilting bloom. "Sarah, he's a little boy." "No," Sarah insisted. "I need to know. Did a boy named Leo ever live around here? Please, it's important." She pressed him about what Leo looked like, what he said. Josh's answers were frustratingly vague, yet chilling. "He's kind of blurry," he offered once, squinting in concentration. "Like when you look through a window when it's raining. And he's quiet. He doesn't talk a lot, but he's really good at swinging. The best." When she pushed her mother again,
Helen's composure finally cracked. Her face grew pale, and her hands, holding the gardening shears, began to tremble. "I can't," she whispered, her voice tight with distress. "I don't remember. Please, Sarah, just leave it alone." But Sarah couldn't leave it alone. Her mother's evasiveness wasn't a sign of a failing memory. It was a wall, built to hold back something terrible. And Sarah knew, with a mother's instinct that was now screaming in alarm, that she would have to be the one to tear it down. The laughter in the dark, the rules of the game, the pull on her son, it was all leading somewhere. And she was terrified of the destination.
A mother's fear is a powerful fuel. It burned away Sarah's exhaustion, her grief, and replaced it with a singular, driving purpose: find Leo. If her mother wouldn't talk, the past itself would have to. Her investigation began at the local library, a place of hushed quiet that felt a world away from the nightly creaking in her backyard. The librarian, a kind woman with bifocals, pointed her towards the archives, bound volumes of the local newspaper and dusty microfilms of town records. For hours, Sarah scrawled through fuzzy, black-and-white images of decades-old news, the monotonous whir of the microfilm reader a soundtrack to her search. She scanned school yearbooks from her own era, searching for a face, a name. Nothing. Just as she was about to give up, her eyes raw from staring at the glowing screen, she found it. It was a small article, tucked away in the back pages of a paper from the autumn of 1993, almost 30 years ago. The headline was simple: "Local boy dies in tragic accident." Her breath hitched. Her hands trembled as she read. The boy's name was Leo Peterson. He was 8 years old. He had lived 3 houses down from her own. The article was sparse on details, written with the careful, respectful distance of small-town journalism. It mentioned a fall, a head injury, an accident at his home where he had been left alone. But it was the final paragraph that made the blood drain from her face. It was a quote from a neighbor who described Leo as a quiet, lonely boy who was often neglected. He spent nearly all his time playing by himself, the neighbor was quoted as saying. He loved that swing set at the end of the street in the miller's backyard. It was the only place you ever saw him smile. The miller's backyard. Her backyard. The connection slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. The entity in her yard wasn't some random malevolent spirit. It was him. It was the specific, lingering, psychic echo of a lonely little boy forever tied to the one and only place where he had ever felt a sliver of happiness or safety. He wasn't malicious. He was a child, stuck in a loop of his only good memory, desperately, achingly lonely, and now reaching out to the only other person who could see him, another lonely little boy. That night, propelled by the discovery, she searched the house, not for a ghost, but for a memory. In the back of her old childhood closet, buried under a pile of forgotten board games and stuffed animals, she found a cardboard box labeled Sarah's Art. Her hands, coated in a fine layer of dust, pulled it out. Inside were crayon drawings on faded construction paper, a portfolio of her childhood. There were lopsided houses with smoke curling from the chimneys, smiling stick-figure families under a giant yellow sun. And then she saw it. It was a drawing of the swing set. On one swing, she had drawn a girl with a bright pink dress and pigtails, herself. But on the swing next to her was another figure. It was faint, smudged, as if drawn with less pressure or perhaps partially erased. It was just a blurry outline of a boy. And underneath him, in her own childish looping cursive, was a single word: Leo. The memory, locked away for 30 years, came rushing back. A quiet boy with sad eyes, a playmate she never invited, but who was just there. A fleeting presence at the edge of her own happy childhood. A boy she had known, and then, alone with the rest of the neighborhood, had completely, utterly forgotten.
The ghost in her yard wasn't a stranger. She had played with him.
Armed with a truth she could no longer deny, Sarah approached her son. She found him in his room, carefully arranging his toy cars in a perfect line. She sat on the edge of his bed, her heart a painful knot in her chest. "Josh," she began gently, holding out the faded drawing. "I remember him too." Josh looked from the drawing to his mother's face. For the first time, he saw not fear or disbelief, but recognition. The guarded look in his eyes softened, the wall between them crumbling. He finally opened up. "He wants me to play a new game," Josh said, his voice barely a whisper. "He told me the secret. He said, if you swing really high, high enough to touch the moon, you can go somewhere else." A cold dread, sharper and more terrifying than anything she had felt before, seized Sarah. "Somewhere else? What do you mean, sweetie?" "A place where you're never sad again," Josh said, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and longing. "Leo's there. He says it doesn't hurt. He's waiting for me." The invitation. It wasn't a threat made with malice. It was a promise made with the profound, dangerous innocence of a dead child who didn't understand the barrier between worlds. Leo, in his eternal loneliness, was trying to lure her son into the afterlife to be his playmate forever. That night, the presence in the backyard intensified. It was no longer a subtle echo. It was a desperate psychic scream. The swings moved almost constantly, their creaking no longer rhythmic but frantic, swinging higher and more violently than Sarah had ever seen, as if in a state of wild, hopeful anticipation. A palpable coldness radiated from the yard, a heavy blanket of sorrow that seeped through the walls of the house. Time was running out. She went to her mother, her face set. In her hands, she held the brittle newspaper clipping and her own childhood drawing. She laid them on the kitchen table without a word. Helen stared at the two artifacts, at the name Leo Peterson in print, and the smudged, forgotten figure on the swing. The carefully constructed dam of her memory finally broke. A sob tore from her throat, a sound of guilt 30 years in the making. "We knew," she confessed, tears streaming down her face. "Oh God, Sarah, we all knew. Everyone on this street knew that poor boy was lonely, that his parents didn't care for him properly. He was always just wandering, and he loved your swing set." Her voice was thick with shame. "After he died, it was so awful, so senseless, and we all just agreed to forget. Not with words, but with silence. We packed the tragedy away. We moved on." She looked at Sarah, her eyes pleading for an understanding Sarah couldn't yet give. "The swing. It started moving sometimes not long after he was gone. We all saw it, my father and I, the neighbors. We told ourselves it was the wind. It was easier to believe in the wind than to believe he was still out there, all alone. It was just a sad quirk of the old house. It was easier to forget him." But Leo had refused to be forgotten. And now, after 30 years of waiting, he had finally found a friend who wouldn't look away. Panic was a live wire in Sarah's chest, urging her to do something drastic. Tear down the swing set, burn it, salt the earth where it stood. But she knew, instinctively, that such a violent act would be a mistake. It wouldn't sever the connection. It might enrage the lonely spirit, and would certainly traumatize her own son, who saw Leo not as a threat, but as a friend. The pull was too strong, a psychic bond forged in the shared furnace of grief and loneliness. She couldn't forbid the game. She had to intervene in it. That evening, as twilight settled, and the first star appeared in the deepening blue, Sarah walked out to the swing set alone. The air was cold, heavy. As she approached, one swing began to move, a slow, expectant back and forth. The familiar creak, creak was the only sound in the yard. She didn't sit on the still swing. She sat on the one next to Leo's, the one she had occupied in her own childhood drawing. The plastic was cold against her legs. She took a deep breath, pushing past the fear that made her want to run back inside. She spoke aloud, her voice soft but clear, filled not with fear, but with a gentle, aching empathy. "Leo," she said to the empty moving seat beside her. "My name is Sarah. I used to live here, a long time ago." The swinging didn't stop. It continued its steady, ghostly rhythm. "I remember you," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I have a drawing I made of you and me on these swings. I'm sorry I forgot. We all forgot, and I am so sorry that you were so lonely." She wasn't trying to perform an exorcism. She was offering an apology. "Josh is my son. He's a wonderful boy, and he's your friend. I know you just want someone to play with, but he can't come play with you in your world, Leo. He has to stay here, with me." She was speaking to the memory, to the pain, to the unheard child. "We remember you now. You're not forgotten anymore." At her words, the motion of the swing faltered. It hesitated at the peak of its arc, the rhythmic creak stuttering to a stop. The air grew colder, heavy with a profound, bottomless sadness that felt ancient. It was the concentrated grief of 1,000 lonely nights. For a moment, Sarah thought she heard a sound carried on the wind, not laughter this time, but a faint, hitching sob, the sound of a child's heartbreak. It was a moment of immense psychic and emotional pressure. She felt the weight of his solitude, his confusion, his longing. She was trying to reason with the unfiltered sorrow of a ghost who only knew how to play one game, and she was asking him, after 30 years of waiting, to let his only friend go. The swing hung perfectly still, as if holding its breath, waiting for her next move in a game whose rules had suddenly changed. But quiet didn't last. That night, a storm of unseen energy broke over the house. The swinging started again, but it was no longer expectant or sad. It was frantic, desperate. The creak, creak, creak was a frantic metallic heartbeat, faster and louder than ever before. The chains groaned in protest as the empty seat flew higher and higher, a wild, violent arc against the moonlit sky. Sarah lay in bed, listening, knowing it was Leo's final, desperate attempt, a final urgent invitation. A floorboard creaked in the hall. Sarah was out of bed in an instant. She found Josh standing by the back door, fully dressed, his small hand on the knob. He wasn't sleepwalking. His eyes were wide and awake. "Leo is waiting," he said, his voice calm, almost dreamy. "He says it's time. He says tonight we can touch the moon." Sarah's first instinct was to scream, to pull him away from the door and lock it. But she saw the look on his face, not fear, but a solemn acceptance. Anger wouldn't work. She knelt down in front of him. "Okay," she said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "Let's go see him." She took his small, trusting hand in hers. In her other hand, she clutched the items she'd taken from her desk, the old yellowed newspaper photo of Leo and her own crayon drawing. They walked out into the cold night together. The backyard felt charged, the air humming with a strange energy. The one swing was a blur of motion, a terrifying, powerful display. Sarah didn't flinch. She walked directly to the swing set, and with Josh still holding her hand, she sat on the other, still seat, pulling him onto her lap. She held him tight, a warm, living shield against the cold of the night. The wild swinging continued beside them, a gale of invisible force. "Leo," Sarah called out over the noise, her voice ringing with maternal authority and profound compassion. "We're here, but the game has to end now." She held up the photograph, turning it towards the empty swing. "This is you. This is Leo Peterson. I see you. We see you." Then she held up the drawing. "And this is us, you and me. I remember playing with you. You're not just an invisible friend, you're real, and you are not alone anymore." She spoke to the ghost as she would her own child. She acknowledged his game, his desire to touch the moon. "It's a good game, Leo, but Josh can't play it. He has to stay here and live his life. He has to grow up, just like you should have been able to." She paused, then offered a new path. "Let's play a new game, a different one. The first one to see the morning sun wins. Can you wait for the sun, Leo?" She was reframing his reality, giving him a new focus, a new purpose beyond the endless night of his lonely game. She was offering him not an exit, but a conclusion. Love, closure, and memory were her only weapons. As she spoke, the impossible happened. The frantic swinging began to slow. The arc lessened, the desperate energy bleeding out into the night air. The violent groaning of the chains softened into a gentle creak, and then silence. The swing slowed, swayed, and in a final gentle arc came to a complete stop. For the first time in weeks, both swings hung perfectly still. A profound peace, deep and absolute, settled over the yard. The oppressive cold vanished, replaced by the simple, clean chill of an autumn night. The presence was gone. Josh stirred in her lap, his body relaxing against hers. He looked at the still swing, then up at his mother. "He's gone," he whispered. "Yes, sweetie," Sarah said, kissing the top of his head, tears of relief finally falling. "He's gone to wait for the sun."
In the days that followed, an unfamiliar peace settled over the house. The swing set in the backyard remained perfectly, beautifully still. The heavy feeling of being watched was gone, replaced by the simple quiet of a suburban lawn. The air felt lighter. Josh stopped talking about Leo. It wasn't a sad silence, but a healthy one, as if a friend he'd been worried about had finally found his way home. The space that Leo had occupied in his mind was now free, and into it flowed the memories he'd been holding back. He started talking more about his dad, asking questions, sharing stories. He was finally processing his grief in the real world, anchored by the living, not the dead. The healing had begun. A few weeks later, Sarah stood with her mother in the yard, looking at the old swing set. It no longer looked menacing, just old and tired, a relic of a past that now held both joy and sorrow. "I think it's time," Helen said softly. Sarah nodded, but dismantling it and selling it for scrap felt wrong, like another act of erasure. "No," Sarah said, "let's fix it." And so they did. Together, mother and daughter, they worked. They sanded away the rust and the peeling red paint, stripping it down to the bare metal. They tightened the bolts and lubricated the joints. They bought 2 new bright yellow seats and sturdy new chains. Then they repainted the entire frame a cheerful, brilliant blue. It was a symbolic act of transformation, a conscious choice to turn a site of lonely grief into a beacon of future joy. They didn't scrap it. They donated it to a new playground being built at the local elementary school, a place where it would be filled with the laughter of many children, a place where it would never be empty again. Months later, life had found a new, gentle rhythm. Sarah sat at the kitchen table one evening, putting together a new family photo album. In it, she placed pictures of Michael, his smiling face a warm and cherished memory, not a source of fresh pain. She added photos of her and Josh, of her and her mother, snapshots of their new, quiet life. Then, she took out the brittle newspaper clipping and the small, faded photograph of Leo Peterson. She slid them carefully into a protective sleeve and placed it in the back of the album. She would not let him be forgotten again. His story was now part of her own. As she worked, Josh was at the other end of the table, drawing with a set of new markers. When he was finished, he held it up for her to see. It was a picture of the new playground. The blue swing set stood in the center, and on its 2 yellow seats were laughing stick-figure children. More children were on the slide, the monkey bars, all under a bright, smiling sun. But it was the sky that caught Sarah's breath. High above the playground, amidst a scattering of simple 5-pointed stars, Josh had drawn one special star. It was shaped unmistakably like the outline of a small, happy boy waving down at the world below.